All right, everyone, thank you so much for being here. Professor Weiss is going to give a wonderful presentation regarding capitalism and socialism. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to use the chat feature as I will be taking care of the moderating of that regarding your questions. Or I'm sure that Professor Weiss would be able to answer your questions mid-presentation if you wanted to use the raise your hand feature, as well as after the presentation, you could always stay on a few more minutes to ask your questions. All right, without further ado, please go ahead, Professor.
Okay, thank you, everybody. I have been asked to give a talk, what is capitalism and what is socialism? And the first screen you see here is Simon and Garfunkel, The Sounds of Silence. And capitalism may be the most significant word that we don't really use or even take time to define. So if we look at how capitalism and socialism are portrayed in our general society, it's usually socialism versus capitalism. We also oftentimes equate capitalism and democracy, or socialism not being affiliated with democracy. But capitalism and socialism are both economic systems. That's the first portion of a definition of either capitalism or socialism. Both are economic systems. Capitalism exists in many different societies. It existed in apartheid South Africa, for example. Capitalists existed at the fall of the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich. Socialism and aspects of socialism have existed in many different societies. Neither is automatically equated with the demos or people rule. Capitalism and socialism are economic systems. In fact, for the purposes of this presentation, I want you to be thinking about capitalism and socialism rather than capitalism versus socialism. Now, when we think about the global economy today, we live in a world of nation states, and we live in a world dominated by global capitalism. Now, if you look at Denmark and Finland on this screen, their GDP combined, the total financial value of all the revenues in those two countries combined, is equal to the revenues of Walmart in a single year. And what is economics anyway? I say to my students, economics is like a bad sounding drug, PDC, like don't do PDC, to emphasize production, distribution, and consumption. The production, distribution, and consumption of goods and services. Now, when we think about production, you see with this graphic, Nestle China. China is the largest manufacturer in the world, often described as sort of the workshop of the world. And that's China Nestle. Nestle happens to be one of the largest producers, the largest food companies in the world. And for distribution, we have what I call the Amazon empire. Now, production and distribution, once again, PD, the biggest oil and gas companies in the world. Most of the world's gas and oil is owned by governments, production, but most of the distribution of gas and oil is owned by transnational corporations like British Petroleum or ExxonMobil. There's a wonderful book by Pietra Rivoli called The Travels of a T-shirt in a Global Society. She grabbed a random T-shirt at Walgreens and she followed the PDC, production, distribution, and consumption, the entire supply value chain of that T-shirt, and looked at the cotton, where it came from, Egypt, Uganda, looked at the production in maquiladoras, the distribution system. And one of the things that she concluded in her book, as did Yanis Varoufakis, I'm quoting him, he's a former Greek finance minister, is that economics is society. It's what you and I do. It's a social science. Economics is the study of human behavior. Now, capitalism. In capitalism, the means of production are privately owned. The land, the labor, and the resources are commodified. I'm not going to go into where capitalism came from, but in an excellent book by Varoufakis called Teaching Economics to My Daughter, he explains how during feudalism, the lords and the people who ruled the estates looked out onto the fields and they saw their miserable peasants and serfs picking onions and beets and broccoli. And they said, you know, if we just kick these miserable peasants and serfs off of the land and replace them with sheep, then we can gather the wool and we can sell it on the global market. This was the great transformation, what are called the Enclosure Acts in Europe at the time, the transformation from feudalism to capitalism. Before this point, land or real estate pages was not commodified per se. And so what did the peasants and serfs do? They ran off the land and they ran around and they knocked on doors asking if somebody would hire them to work so that they could buy bread. So for the first time in history, labor is commodified. Serfs and peasants lived on an estate, and land was inherited. It wasn't bought and sold. So capitalism is a recent phenomenon, only in the last couple centuries, and it has radically changed the world that we live in. One of the big changes is what Varoufakis says in his book, the change from experiential value to exchange value. In fact, economics is a Greek word which means home production, home output. That's why when I was a child, we had classes called home economics. That definition of economics, or experiential value, in other words, goods, you wash your car, or you wash your dad's car, you do him a favor. Everybody in the household produces and distributes the food on a dinner table. And where we have moved today is something what Varoufakis calls exchange value. We now live in a society where everything is bought and sold. I mean, including the womb of a woman, which is sold to surrogate parents. Exchange value dominates all of our relationships. Now, this is Phil Knight, the CEO of Nike. And when I teach this in a classroom, I tell my students that they should picture themselves as the board of directors for Nike. So maybe you have Merrill Lynch sitting here, you have Merck sitting over here, you have Johnson & Johnson, different corporations that are on the board of directors for Nike. And if Phil Knight is giving a talk on the state of Nike, and he says something like this, you know, board of directors, I went to church last night and I read from the Acts of the Apostles and something about sharing economy. And, you know, we are going to move all of Nike's production facilities outside of Asia. We're going to move them to the United States. We're going to pay a living wage. And then Phil Knight leaves the room. What do the board of directors say when he leaves the room? And of course, the board of directors, as my students realize, would say, how soon do we get rid of Phil Knight? He has lost his mind. Now, they could also be worried about CNBC or Bloomberg or something finding out this news of what it would do to Nike's stock price. That is because capitalism is a logical system. It operates under what's called the profit motive. I tease my students and I say, make money or die. Well, I don't test them and make them say make money or die, but I want to emphasize that companies and capitalism has a very logical impetus to it, and that is the profit motive. A wonderful quote from David Roderick, the former president of U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel is not in the business of making steel. By the way, neither is Nike. Nike is not in the business of making shoes. They're not in the business of making athletic wear. They're in the business of making profits. Now, one of the reasons that's confusing to people is because there is a hundreds of billions dollar advertising industry that tells you that corporations are and companies are doing everything in capitalism but making a profit. I mean, the entire advertising industry. I mean, can you imagine an advertisement that says, buy this pair of shoes for $148. It costs $117 to produce and distribute. Buy this so Nike can accumulate $31 in profits, paid for by Nike Corporation. I wouldn't hold your breath that you're ever going to see this commercial. So as a consequence, the word profits is largely missing from our media landscape, which is also privately owned. Of course, we endlessly hear about the lifestyles of the billionaires. I believe Mr. Bezos went to space recently. And the individuals who you see here, Oprah with Cook, the CEO of Apple, all together, they have as much wealth as the bottom 160 million people in the United States population. It wasn't always that way. I grew up in the 70s where the United States was a much different society. You have workers sometimes who protest and they hold signs that say end corporate greed. This is about like standing outside of Lambeau Field with a sign that says stop violent football. Now, how does capitalism operate? How does it make a profit? The two main roles in capitalism are sellers and buyers. The sellers want to sell as little as possible for as much as possible. The buyers want to buy as much as possible for as little as possible. This is the dynamic, the general dynamic that determines the price of every product we buy. Think of you going into a Toyota shop. It would be cool to walk in there and say, look, I have 78 cents in my pocket. I would like a 2021 Corolla. Hey, throw in an Avalon, throw in a Camry, and I'll give you 78 cents. And it would be good for the Toyota dealership to be able to say, you know what, this one Corolla costs $11.5 million. We'll sell it. Now, if we go back to this slide, people tend to think that sellers want to sell as much as possible. But no, not true. You want your PD, production and distribution costs, to be as low as possible. That is why in capitalism, capitalists are not in business to hire workers. In fact, any capitalist operation that is smart, and most of them are, wants to hire as the minimum number of workers possible to maximize profits. We are not capitalists. I'm guessing that nobody can hear my voice during this lecture owns the means of production. So how do we survive in capitalism? Well, we rent our time and labor to the private sector. We rent our time and labor to the private sector. And here's how it's worked. The employer wants the employee to work as much as possible for as little as possible. Well, I think you can now understand the emergence of capitalism, the logic of the transatlantic slave trade, right? The employer wants an employee to work as much as possible for as little as possible. Although that doesn't fit another paradigm of capitalism, but it certainly fits the profit motive. And an employee wants to work as little as possible for as much as possible. So, you know, you might walk into McDonald's and say, hey, I have an idea. I'll sit in the corner, I'll sip coffee, for a couple hours and you pay me $84 an hour. This dynamic between the employer and the employee is, of course, what determines wages. It's what determines whether a union goes on strike for lower work hours or to have weekends off and things like that. Now, capitalism is not about markets per se. There have always been markets. Anytime where a human being is trading an orange for a banana in the Middle Ages, or even when humans, before the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, before a surplus was created, there were markets. Markets are just a card of exchange. And I also tell my students, people like to use the term free market, but all governments write, enforce, and interpret law. Governments are about the L word. Governments are about law. Law is government and government is law. So I can't grow marijuana in my backyard because it's illegal by law in the state of Iowa. And I can't sell it in the middle of Target because Target has a license to sell from the government. So when you think about it, there is no such thing as 100% free market. Furthermore, all governments tax and spend. So all governments have to decide what to tax, what to incentivize in terms of production and distribution. In fact, there are really no capitalist countries in the world, and there are no socialist countries in the world. And if you look at something like your iPhone, nearly everything on your iPhone, internet connectivity, GPS, was created by government, in particular the Department of Defense. I mean, the internet was established by the military industrial complex as a way to track people. It's essentially been turned over to corporations to also to track people, to sell them things. Bill Clinton in 1993 gave a talk at Boeing, and he talked about the wonders of the market. But I don't know about you and but I haven't received a $30 billion check in the mail from the national government recently. But the largest weapons contractors, which is the largest segment of the United States economy, I mean, the United States has had a permanent war economy since World War II, receive massive contracts and subsidies from government. So to talk about Boeing as the free market is living in a different universe. Um, the National Institutes of Health of the United States of America were quite critical in creating the mRNA vaccine. In fact, the young woman over here who's 34 years old, who is talking with President Biden, is actually credited with being one of the main scientists for creating the COVID-19 vaccine. And once again, it's marketed under Moderna. It's marketed under Moderna in part because the government felt that people would be more likely to get the vaccine if they didn't acknowledge that it was largely created by government laboratories. Extraordinary vaccines. Capitalism is then, let's review. It's an economic system. In capitalism, the means of production are privately owned. The motivation is private profit. The majority of the people rent their time and labor to the private sector. And I also add that all markets are politically manufactured. None of them stand alone. And there really are no capitalist nation states or socialist nation states, only mixed economies. In fact, let's start looking at socialism. So I often ask my students what their first encounter with government is, and they figure it out. It's when they flush the toilet. Sometimes if I have students who say, gee, I don't want to be part of government at all, you have to remind them that you have to get rid of your own human waste in the morning. So when you think about private sector versus public sector, public sanitation, public waterworks, public roads, public libraries, public schools, etc. In fact, I kind of make it easy on my students. Everywhere in my definition of capitalism where I have the word private, I just substitute the word public. And a few years ago, I had a much longer answer for the motivation for production and distribution. And a student said, hey, why don't you just say public profit? And I said, you know what, that works. Now, oftentimes where you see socialism would be in key industries. For example, Egypt Air, which is owned by the government. There are airlines in many different countries that are at least owned wholly or partially by the state. The National Health Service, the NHS of the United Kingdom, is publicly delivered, publicly paid for healthcare. In fact, the doctors and the hospitals are employees of the national government in the United Kingdom. In fact, the Veterans Administration, what's known as the VA in the United States, is also socialistic because it's the doctors and nurses who work at the VA are government employees. What does socialism look like? The idea of nationalizing all the means of production has largely gone away. There are few, if any, socialist parties or even the few communist parties that exist in the world that call to nationalize Starbucks or to nationalize all the means of production. Many countries nationalize key industries. I talked about the largest gas and oil companies in the world are owned by governments, the production. There are public ownership cooperatives. There's a nonprofit sector in many economies. And there's what are called worker-owned self-directed enterprises. We don't have time to talk about it, but Mondragon is the 7th largest company in Spain. And it's essentially owned by the workers. It's own self-directed enterprises. I also have Cooperation Jackson, Mississippi, which is really African Americans and others who are trying to work together in terms of the production and distribution of in workplaces and forming cooperatives in Jackson, which is really interesting. Hy-Vee is a little bit like that, but still, of course, with the profit motive. Now, I've had students ask me, what is democratic socialism? And the best that I can figure is one thing here, you have picture of the largest political parties in Europe, at least especially in the countries that have parliamentary governments. And most of them, even the conservative parties in Europe, have aspects of democratic socialism. I mean, even a conservative in Switzerland would say, well, of course, healthcare is a human right. So social and economic rights are taken somewhat normal in most places around the world. The United States is a bit of an aberration or aberration for not acknowledging social and economic rights. I mean, our political class, more of our political class does, but for most of history, not so much. Now, democratic socialism, the way I look at it, is the idea of every society has to determine what our needs and what our wants. The needs are paid for collectively, and the wants, like a cup of coffee, are paid for individually. And I really think that if we're talking about an economy is society, it's what you and I do, it's a social science. Any society has to determine what should be paid for individually and what should be paid for collectively. And as you know, much of Europe, in terms of education, healthcare, and housing, those things are paid for collectively, and increasingly also in South American parts of Asia. China is an interesting country because economists wonder what to call it. Some say China practices state capitalism, which is the largest industries are largely owned and operated by the state, but they have a profit motive and they compete in the global market. Others will say China is capitalism with Chinese characteristics. Others will say it's socialism with Chinese characteristics. But you can read this quote from Deng Xiaoping from 1979. It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, so long as it catches mice. In other words, we don't really care what you call it as long as it works. Interestingly enough, Niall Ferguson is an economist who's done some interesting work and political scientist. And he notes that if you look at government spending as a percentage of GDP, several European countries are actually more sort of socialistic than China. China's healthcare system too is I would say shockingly fee for service, and less socialistic than most European countries. So state capitalism may be more of a European phenomena than a Chinese phenomena. There's the leader of the free world, no longer the leader of the free world, Angela Merkel of Germany. She, in fact, is no longer the prime minister. Of course, Germany just had an election. They're still trying to sort it out, parliamentary government. But she talked about three numbers, 7, 25, and 50. I apologize because they're hard to read on this graph. Europe is 7% of the world population. Europe is 25% of global GDP, and they are 50% of social spending. Even North Korea has some capitalism. In fact, North Korea, shockingly, may have some of the freest and smallest markets in the world because they have a black market of farmers markets that New York Times and New Yorker have been writing about, that essentially the government isn't breaking up. In fact, in the book I showed you, following the travels of a t-shirt that was purchased at Walgreens, the author actually said the freest markets she saw were African farmers markets. In other words, where sellers sold as little as possible for as much as possible, and buyers bought as much as possible for as little as possible outside of government interference. But once again, there is no such thing as a free market. Now, capitalism and socialism, all countries have mixed economies. In other words, both capitalism and socialism. Paris has its thousands and thousands of local cafes. China has its Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, Kentucky Fried Chicken may have been saved by China. And Nigeria, Lagos, you see the photo there, they have a lot of local restaurants, and then you have the breweries of Germany. So I just want to say every economy, to the extent that it is capitalistic or socialistic, needs to be looked at all by itself. Here is another thing if you look at healthcare, single payer healthcare in Canada. Well, oftentimes our politicians will say socialized medicine in Canada, But really, that's not true because many of the doctors in China, Japan has a similar healthcare system, are private. You have a lot of private doctors and private hospitals, capitalism, but you have a national payment system, socialism, called single payer, meaning everybody pays into it and everybody gets it. Now, when capitalism emerged, Adam Smith observed the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. He talked about the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. The idea that sort of the private vice could be turned into public virtue, that the butcher, the brewer, and the baker would try to cut the best meat, brew the best beer, and bake the best bread and sell it at the lowest possible price. And that the consumer, production, distribution, consumption, the C, the consumer would determine the survival of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. And Adam Smith talked about in The Wealth of Nations this new economic system that was emerging. Adam Smith also recognized, however, that capital is really dead labor. Capital can't produce anything by itself. People who are owners of companies like to say they're putting their money to work, but without labor, they can't put their money to work. Without labor, you can't produce a pencil. Without labor, you can't produce a pencil factory. So Adam Smith recognized the sort of the mathematical equation that nature plus labor equals wealth. I suppose this is what Karl Marx, who critiqued capitalism as it was emerging in the mid-19th century, I suppose this is what Marx meant by class consciousness, the extent to which the workers understood that this dynamic of production and distribution is a reality. Now, today, the United States is often described by the French and the Europeans as practicing hyper-capitalism. I mean, to some extent, the butcher, the baker, and the brewer have been replaced by Cargill, Miller Coors, Anheuser-Busch, and Pepsi. And if you look at industry after industry in the United States, you ask the question of the level of competitiveness that actually exists. We have 6 or 7 large media corporations that own much of our information universe. There's a wonderful quote from a political scientist. Media in the United States is not part of corporate America. Media in the United States is not close to corporate America. Media in the United States is corporate America. I mean, MSNBC, who put the MS in NBC? Microsoft, is the MS in it. So our media is generally economically conservative while almost not ever talking about capitalism, and of course not the profit motive. You'd never see that in corporate advertising. And socially liberal is the general breakdown of, let's say, a CNN or an MSNBC. 2 beer companies control about 70% of the beer market. In terms of the largest airlines, one of the largest hubs in the world in Atlanta is almost entirely dominated by Delta, which I believe is headquartered in Atlanta. Now, Adam Smith, who definitely talked about a capitalism for small producers and distributors, was immediately critical of monopolies and immediately critical of the Dutch East India Company and other large enterprises. In fact, he actually said that the monopoly or the large company was like an overgrown standing army that owned the politicians, that was sort of able to buy the political class to do their bidding. I could put up quotes from Adam Smith all day, and I could probably juxtapose them with quotes from Marx. And there's actually a lot of economists at the time, and they're quite poignant in a lot of ways to look at the modern times of how capitalism has unfolded. Capitalism today does not resemble the capitalism that Adam Smith wrote about. Here he says the rate of profit does not rise with the prosperity and the fall of society. It is always the highest profit in the countries which are going the fastest to their ruin. Wow. Interesting. The Dutch East India Company, 1599, was really a game changer. I hate the word game changer, it's overused, so I apologize. But it was the time where people began to buy shares in a company. They would then have partial ownership of a company, and this really has transformed and changed so much of the dynamic of capitalism. The period of colonialism, access to resources, cheap labor, and conquering markets. And when we talk about conquering markets, we think about Facebook and Google, for example, which really have a duopoly of dominating the entire internet in terms of advertising. There's a wonderful quote from Varoufakis where he talks about Facebook. Everybody who goes into Facebook leaves capitalism entirely. There's no competition. They charge you for advertising. They have a remarkable behavioral modification mechanism, algorithms. What is the capital of Facebook? It is your post. He asked the question, how much of Facebook's revenue does it pay to its workers? 1%. Even Walmart pays 40% of its tax revenues to its workforce, because all of us work for Facebook and we don't even know it. We are simultaneously the proletariat and the consumer. This isn't capitalism, Varoufakis says. He says, and Facebook doesn't need the army of East India to conquer markets overseas. They have the American army that works for them. The sword usually follows the dollar. Now, I want to end my presentation with, there's a slide that I could not put here because I didn't have time, but it was Casey Kasem's top 40. And it's 70s and 80s music. And so one of the, I would say one of the cultural gifts of capitalism in my lifetime, I think one of the best things that the United States ever gave to the world was the music of the 1970s and 1980s, top 40. Some of it is poignant now. Styx, Mr. Roboto, where machines control the way people think, as I'm sitting here talking to a machine. Styx, Mr. Roboto works pretty well. Pink Floyd, which was a European group, had a lot of music about sort of the alienation and isolation of capitalism. I tell my students, not too much Pink Floyd can get you depressed. But I would personally say that the greatest thing I've seen capitalism produce in my lifetime has been 70s and 80s popular music. Also, if we think about capitalism, it has created the most innovation of any economic system in history. I think it has to get a lot of credit for the rise in life expectancy around the world. We are living longer than ever before. Human beings are the healthiest we've ever been in all of human history. And yes, mixed economies, capitalism and socialism together, get credit for that. But the innovation of capitalism, which has produced creature comforts that we all enjoy, et cetera, has to get a ton of credit. A few last thoughts about capitalism that you would never see on CNN or MSNBC or any other corporate network, or for that matter, even on National Public Radio. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. What I find fascinating about this quote from Oscar Wilde, who was a poet, writer, Irish, is he wrote in the late 19th century. Can you imagine writing this? And what a time to be alive, the late 19th century, the 1800s. Nowadays, people know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. towards the end of his life, the FBI labeled Dr. King as one of the greatest threats to national security in the United States, and FBI tried to destroy Dr. King. You can read all that history, the FBI and Martin Luther King Jr., in part because King had two careers. One was trying to make sure that African Americans could first become citizens of the United States, which they finally achieved in 1965. See, capitalism can function very well with, even in the United States today, we still don't have one person, one vote in the United States. Our votes are still not counted equally, even in 2021. Okay, so once again, capitalism or socialism don't automatically equate to democracy. A couple quotes from Martin Luther King Jr. We have socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, meaning government and public officials tend to work more for people with money, or a congressman is more likely to answer a call from Mark Zuckerberg than they would be for you or me. And what good is sitting at a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger? My thesis was on Dr. King and Malcolm X, and both of them had pretty harsh critiques of capitalism. In fact, both of the leaders came to write that if capitalism is about employers trying to get employees to work as much as possible for as little as possible, then racism would be a logical ideology in capitalism, because it would essentially teach the white workers to not like the African Americans, to not like immigrants. It would set all the workers off against each other on the basis of race. And meanwhile, the people at the top could just continue to count their money, sort of divide and conquer. Both King and Malcolm wrote about that. And of course, none of that ever made the pages of the New York Times. That's what my thesis was about. And this is the last one, which is really the most ominous. You really can have too much of a good thing. If we had finite resources in the world, if we had endless trees, endless oceans, perhaps capitalism would go on and we would prosper forever. But Edward Abbey wrote in the 1960s that growth for the sake of growth is the ideology of the cancer cell. So capitalism requires constant consumption. It requires constant economic growth, whereas our ecological fate, whether we will survive as Homo sapiens, probably requires less consumption and some form of economic system that perhaps has not even yet been created. So I'm done. And any questions or thoughts, go for it. Such a big topic. I hope I didn't go far. Okay, Nancy asked, Mary, should I just start answering questions?
Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Okay, Nancy asked, how would you define a nonprofit? And if you want, talk if I'm not understanding the question correctly, but I mean, that would be a human service agency or another entity that is not for profit. I think one way of talking about a nonprofit as more connected to a socialistic model would be, let's say, in Germany or Switzerland. In both of those countries, for-profit healthcare insurance companies were turned into nonprofits, and they compete for patients rather than profits. So you ask, where does their capital or where does their money come from? It comes from the state. It's really sort of a form of single payer, but the administration or distribution of healthcare is through nonprofit insurance companies. In fact, I've often been shocked why no politicians in the United States don't talk about that as a possible model for the United States moving towards some kind of national healthcare. But so that's one answer I would give you. Okay, socialism versus communism. Emily, good question. When people think of communism, they tend to think of, for example, the Communist Party in the former Soviet Union. Of course, and their economic model was a disaster. Far too much central planning in the means of production, and basically what turned into a one-party state. It's difficult to talk about what communism is, because if you read Marx didn't talk much about what an alternative society would look like. He did say there should be elections, there should be the power of recall. There's some things he did right about that, but mostly he critiqued capitalism. As far as I can understand, communism would be a situation where the workers who work in the factory would own and run the factories, and all of the workers would own and run the means of production, and then the state would wither away. There would almost be no need for a state because the workers would be sort of governing themselves. It would be somewhat like the C word, but the women in the mills in Massachusetts in the late 19th century who said that those who work in the factory should own and run the factories themselves. I guess probably that's what maybe communism would look like. But there have been, of course, communist parties throughout history which are all different, but a huge problem has been a one-party state. What direction do you think our society will be going? Well, it really doesn't matter how I answer that question. I mean, the scientists are very clear that we are in the Anthropocene age, we are in the sixth mass extinction, and this is the first one that human beings have ever caused. And right now, I think our society is in a car, and we're hitting the accelerator to drive off the cliff. So I think that's where we're at. And I think young people are an inspiration. Greta Thunberg and a lot of the young people who understand that a lot of us older people are going to die, and that they are going to inherit, this generation's folly when it comes to climate. So we really have very serious radical changes we need to make right away when it comes to our ecological fate. And I hope that young people lead the way and that the adults, people like me, step aside and follow.
I'm going to verbally ask my question if that's all right.
Yeah, go for it.
So based off of that, do you think that the people that are benefiting the most from capitalism, are they going to be able to make that shift in order for us to be able to come out on the other side of it?
No. I think that capitalism is, once again, I think it's a logical system. I mean, and I don't meaning it's good or bad, but it has a very clear logic of which is the profit motive. And if you don't make profits, you don't survive. And so, I mean, I think that for the future of humanity, if we are interested in democracy, the demos, people rule, that really probably people will need to get on the streets and, and enforce governments to change. I don't really see any other way. I mean, there are, of course, a lot of governments around the world that are moving quicker. I mean, Sweden, Germany, there's a lot of the West will be buying, you know. But I think in terms of the masses, if we want to survive as a species long term, I mean, we'll long be dead before we see the worst of it. But I think the demos will have to make, we'll have to be vocal and make the change.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. Are there any other questions for Professor Weiss?
I do. I have a quick question. I'm trying to get my head wrapped around the two of them, and how do you think nonprofits going forward in the environmental issue area can work with corporations? Do you think we can get them to help fund the environmental efforts through grants or?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, there are some companies probably that are willing to, what's the word? I mean, make the move to renewables or try to move the economy in that direction. But I think that, nonprofits, and they need to keep trying. I mean, we have no choice. We have to do everything right now. It's just like Ban Ki-moon, who spoke at Drake a few years ago, was the Secretary General of the world's top diplomat. He said, there is no planet B, and so, right. I mean, I would still, if I work for a nonprofit, do everything I can, but I would also be sober enough to realize that, we couldn't put our hopes in an entity that has growth for the sake of growth, that has to make profits. I mean, once again, if capitalism is making a 3% return in the city, but they can make an 8% return in the suburbs, they're going to their suburbs, and that's natural. That's the logic of the system. There's a nice saying: the only certainty of being a capitalist is uncertainty, because the market can always go bad. So, always keeping that profit motive in the back of one's mind. I mean, it could be that over time, the renewable energies, the solar, the wind, and those things are made profitable by governments, and that's happening in several governments around the world. But we definitely would have to move our government. I mean, one of the challenges, as you know, in the United States is that money is speech. So you know, according to the Supreme Court, you know, corporations are people. So Disney has a First Amendment right to freedom of the press, and they own thousands of radio stations, TV stations, etc. And you and I also have freedom of the press. Okay, so freedom of the press belongs to those who own one, you know, is an old saying. And so, you know, that's a challenge, and that's why a lot of European countries will say the United States practices hyper capitalism, although of course we also have socialistic institutions here too.
Great, that was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any more questions?
Oh, thanks, Heather. I would rather be talking to people than a machine, but I understand. We need to do it. Thank you for
All
bearing
right.
with me.
I think that if there are no more questions for Professor, we'll just go ahead and end the session. But feel free in the future to contact Professor Weiss if you have any questions regarding this particular topic. I think you did a great job, Jeff. It was very informative.
Oh, thanks, Mary.